Hi, and welcome to my fourth lecture in hyperthematics, logic of value. And today's lecture is on narrative, which essentially means stories and any speeches, anything spoken using words and so on like this. So in our usual way, we will start by going back to our method and trying to interpret narrative back to our opening assumption, H. You remember with our little schematic maybe earlier that our assumption was that there's experience and different experience and some interpretation between them. And this was the structure of meaning and value in experience. So does narrative, can narrative fit into that schema, in other words? Well, if you think about it, evidently it can. So if we have, for example, a writer, one sort of experience, and we have a reader, another sort of experience, then we have, for example, a text which interprets between them. The writer writes out the text and it brings the experience of the writer to some reader, and in many cases some reader very far away in time and space. But that's not the only way, of course. You can start by saying that the narrative, for example, the book which is written, is the experience, and the listener is a different experience, in which case the reader interprets between them, you see? So, in other words, indeed, narrative fits with our opening assumption, is consistent with our opening assumption. Can we interpret narrative back to H3? H3 suggested that we have at least 3 elements in beginning our communities to stabilize them. So again, you can consider these as elements, and so the writer is one element, the reader is another element, and the text interpreting between them is a third element. And in fact, there are usually many linked processes. These are processes, remember, from the first lecture. The experiences are fluid, they're moving happenings, what is going on, but between each of them as an interpretation, there are other interpretations, right? So between the writer and the text as elements, we can have the publisher, for example. And between the text and the reader as an element, we can have the glasses, which help the reader to read, which are, again, made by some other process which overlaps but is outside these processes in our usual way of thinking. Can we interpret back to H1? H1 said, create hyperthematic structures which don't eliminate elements. So, does narrative eliminate elements? When you're writing a book, are you eliminating? Not really. There's a special sense of practice, which I'll talk about later when we talk about dance. But I'll leave it aside for now and say that no, you don't eliminate. You can write, if you're a writer, you can write a book and you can go on to write another book, right? You can rewrite what you've written as well. And if you're a reader, you can read someone's book and you can read it over again many times. You can pass it on to others and they can read it over many times. So in that sense, hyperthematic structure of narrative doesn't eliminate elements. Can we interpret narrative back to H2? H2 said, use transformations to transformative actions to guide elements acting in a hyperthematic structure out of eliminating other elements of the structure. So, does narrative guide in this way? Well, yes. Engaging in narrative assumes carrying through some interpretation. And carrying through an interpretation is expansive for meaning and thus value and can lead you out of elimination. So, for example, in my little cartoon there, if someone says die to someone else and then kills them, well, they want to get that off first, right? Die, and get that across to them, and then that gives an opening for speech, right? For a dialogue, a narrative, a type of narrative, where the other person maybe gets out of being eliminated, right? Think of this like in the old and the new, I guess, James Bond films. You always have the villains who say, like Goldfinger in the film Goldfinger, "Yeah, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die," sort of like this. But he wants Bond to know about it, right? "I expect you to die, but I'm going to tell you about it, and I want you to think about it. And let's even have a talk about it before I actually kill you." Okay? And so what happens, of course, is Bond always does something clever and gets out of it while they're dialoguing in some way. Narrative works against elimination, in other words. But there are all categories of narrative which go beyond H2. H2 is focused on your own community, so keep your own community from being eliminated. There are all categories which go beyond that and try to prevent eliminations of elements in other hyperthematic structures than your own, the one being acted in, right? So any kind of speech like you get like with Martin Luther King, or these days with Greta Thunberg about global warming, speeches, fairy tales, myths, moral tales, tragedies, and so on. Macbeth, if we read Shakespeare and we read Macbeth, we're supposed, probably, imagine, to get something out of it, such as, don't go doing the things that Macbeth did, or Lady Macbeth, right? And so it's helping the community of narrative, and it's going beyond and spreading out to other communities beyond narrative itself. It can be used by many communities to stabilize many types of communities. All right, so if that's the case, and let's put that in a sort of semi-formal way, and with our usual method, we'll call it H7, hypertheme 7, and we'll say construct communities such that they tend to engage the elements of other communities and prevent them from elimination. And this will be one more principle in our toolkit, which we can apply later to corporations to hopefully increase value. In other words, your communities should engage other communities and stabilize them by keeping them from eliminating parts of their own communities. Teach them, speak to them, warn them from doing whatever. H7, in other words, means go through your reader or listener to warn or teach the communities which are connected to that reader or listener. So how does narrative do that? Well, it does it in picture storytelling, for example, which you see in cave paintings and whatnot. It does it in oral storytelling, where traditions and stories are passed down orally from generation to generation. Great variety. It does it in symbols, right, of various kinds, shapes, sizes, alphabets, and so on. Hieroglyphs. They can be words, can be mixed with music and sung and turned into poetry and so on. And we'll talk a little more about these overlappings of different hyperthematic structures as we go on. In other words, words are very malleable, right? Words are sort of like fabulous contraptions. If you think of this in terms of etymology, they hold, in one aspect of them, their malleability, they hold, in some sense, the history of their development in them. They're always related to things that have come up in the past. They've changed and evolved from root words, which go way back, thousands of years. J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, played with this aspect in writing all of his great works, Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, and that's part of its success, that we feel the history and the passing on of the words, you know, in many cases in English here, but he could do it in Elvish too. He could mimic it. He could make a fake history for different words and different feelings in the book. And we could feel this, you know, many people at least. And this is what makes, you know, a work like Lord of the Rings quite special. Words get passed around between cultures through narrative. They interpret cultures to one another, which is expansive for meaning and increases value. Fairy tales. Consider fairy tales. It's quite likely that a lot of them have come from what I've called in earlier lectures false communities, way back when. A false community is one that eliminates elements in some way, to some degree, but as a core assumption. Right? So in fairy tales, often someone is killed or pushed out of the community, and we can imagine that they arose from experiences where someone in real physical life was killed or pushed out of the community in some way. So take Hansel and Gretel, for example. You have the element of the bad stepmother, the exclusionary element, which enters the community. It says, oh, we can't afford to feed these children anymore. Let's get rid of them finally. Not kill them, but let's push them out. Let's get rid of them indirectly. Convinces the father. Eventually, they get pushed out. You find the witch, an even worse eliminatory element. She kills and she eats children. So there are degrees, right? And the source of Hansel and Gretel may have been the Great Famine of 1314 to 22 in Europe, which was horrible, apparently, and where these kinds of things actually happened. Anyway, in the usual tale, the bad stepmother is removed by fate. In other words, when you act like that sort of thing happens to you one way or another. It comes back on you, right? And the witch, meanwhile, is eliminated by the children. So when you act like that, even stronger sense of elimination, you tend to be eliminated yourself in turn, an even more extreme case. And so the story tells us something like that. And in fact, in the story, the children are even taught, in a certain sense, to be eliminative, right? Gretel pushes the witch in. It's also not good for value. So the original community in Hansel and Gretel, the father and children are sort of then reformed. They get back and they happy ever after sort of thing, but not quite happy ever after, one can imagine. But the whole thing is a sort of a series of warnings to the listener about the eliminative things that we do get up to in communities. In other words, don't do that sort of thing. So narrative and its elements, especially words, allows it to be transformed into different languages, allows that warning, that story, that action, which transforms instead of elimination, allows it to be molded into different experiences. So from witch, you go to German, Hex, to social, and so on. And not just the words, but we can go to the settings, right? You see plays, you see fairy tales changed into medieval, to Japanese, to modern, whatever it might be. You see Shakespeare's plays turned into these sorts of things as well, modern versions, where it occurs in a city instead of in a little country town of 500 years ago. A way to put it is that narrative blossoms outward. Right? The structure and elements of narrative harmonize the actions of people across many different times and places. The Bible, a good example of this. Many other ancient books besides the Bible, of course, Plato, the Republic, and so on. Ancient books that still come down to us. But look, the Bible starts, for example, in texts, as we know, with Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient text on vellum or parchment or whatever it might be. They get interpreted up to medieval times in a different language with different settings and so on. And then they get interpreted on up into modern versions of the Bible, still a book, and then still more modern versions, which are only online, right, digital. And all that way, we're going from narrator to narrator, from earlier parts of the Bible, which are often reinterpreted in later parts. So, for example, in the Old Testament of the Bible, there are the sayings and the deeds and actions of the prophets, and these are reinterpreted into the New Testament, right? And things like this. And then We're going also from narrator to reader, and then we're going from reader to reader, and then reader as a new narrative. Sometimes the text is changed, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's annotated. There are translations made, there are choices made in the translations, and so on. And all this process, we can say, goes on over 25 years. Indeed, in our sense of processes, it makes up the time of the 25 years, in a sense. It passes through these interpretations, and so it passes through everyone and everything, which is element, not just people, in between. So an original experience, we can sort of wildly guess at, where, for example, Moses broke the tablets with the 10 Commandments in anger at certain things. There was some experience back there for someone, and it gets passed on up through to someone's experience right now in the 21st century. So a whole series of linked interpretations. That's the power of narrative. Can narrative fail? Can it, in other words, be inconsistent in our sense we're using here in terms of our opening assumptions and the other principles that we've built up? Yes, it can. But in proportion, for example, as the community of it isn't engaged. So if you don't write a book, no one will ever read it. So you don't participate, in other words, in narrative, that's possible. Or you can participate, but just do a shoddy job, right? Some writers don't bother to learn or to write well from going back to and interpreting the historic community of narrative. Right? You don't go and learn how to write well or to speak well or so forth. And there are devaluative uses of narrative as well. These are more extreme, inconsistent uses of narrative. For example, the book, which is only for some of us, right? Secret spy documents of the State Department, top secret, for your eyes only, destroy afterwards. So these attempts are based on an intent counter to the core of narrative. They're locally, and in this sense of locally inconsistent and locally consistent, I will expand more on later as we go. But they're locally inconsistent because they still rely on the main core of narrative. Interpret some experience of mine or someone else's to someone else. Interpret between an experience and a different experience. At its core, narrative accepts this principle. Not in our, as we use it, we don't consciously think of this. This, of course, I'm only trying to draw out the dynamic logic, and I call it hyperthematics. But at core, narrative accepts this, that you interpret an experience across to someone else, some other experience. And then if you use it badly, use it against this, it's only because you have made this opening choice to actually use that consistency first, a consistent way of dynamically approaching experience. So top secret, always only, one inconsistent use. And there are also, of course, the more extreme eliminative uses. You use narrative to get across to someone that they should eliminate someone or something. Like, of course, one of the worst cases, Hitler's Mein Kampf. So why does narrative succeed? Well, compared to chess. Chess doesn't really spread like narrative does, right? In other words, nothing in the game promotes the spread of chess, relatively speaking. The elements, the people, for example, who are playing, and the pieces are replaceable. And you can sort of see this when we think about it as chess as a sort of symmetrical environment. And we'll talk more about symmetry later. This is a first little glance at what I mean by symmetry. But here, think of a mirror symmetry. So you can see the players across from one another, and the board has a symmetry of sorts, and the pieces have a symmetry in their physical makeup and how many and whatnot, and also in the rules, which are open to them, right? This symmetry feeds into what I call here replaceability. They're sort of two sides of the same coin, if you will. And this is what chess and many games have, right? But not all games. But narrative is different. Narrative lures further readers, writers, speakers into making new interpretations each time. The elements, the words which are spoken or read, the phrases, the stories, the people listening, reading, writing, speaking are more transformable. In other words, a relatively different interpretation has to be made with them every time, at least relative to something like chess, where the fellow on this side, in terms of this chess pawn, and the fellow on the other side, in terms of his chess pawn, are going to make relatively the same sort of move, and the pieces are relatively the same, and so on. They have a symmetry. So the elements of narrative are transformable. The elements are, if you like, little problems in themselves, in the same sense as when we began talking about solving problems with the assumption H. So it's a difference of degree. The elements of narrative lure us into solving them in our own way. So anyone who reads a story written by someone else has their own life context. Spoken words have different ways that each of us pronounce them. Phrases, the ways of stringing words together, we each have our own way, which we prefer, sometimes by habit, sometimes by eccentricity, of stringing our words together. We each, in other words, solve the narrative. When narrative is presented to us, we solve it in our own way. We mold these things to suit ourselves, even while taking something of what the other person meant to get across to us. And this is inherent to the elements of narrative. And this is how narrative spreads. It spreads remarkably widely and quickly, and brings us all together in some larger shared interpretation. So, for example, Walt Whitman, I consider quite a great poet. If Whitman and other poets give us a sense of their experience, they don't mean for us to have their experience. They mean for us to take the words and the malleable sense of what they're giving to us and to connect it to our own experience. So if Whitman is in the evening and the sun is going down or the moon is risen, he expects us to take that to our own experience of some evening when the moon had risen and so on. Ah, yes, I see what he meant. That makes me, it reminds me, and I weave that. I weave his experience into my own, and this is the particular strength of narrative. Chess games are open to further interpretation to some degree, but narrative actually actively promotes further interpretation. So once again, let's go back to method, and we'll call this hypertheme 8. And we'll say, to create hyperthematic structures which engage further actors, insofar as possible, make elements of those structures transformable rather than replaceable. In other words, bring in elements, create them, or bring them in, which have that malleability, in the same sense that words and phrases have the malleability compared to the more static, the more symmetric elements which are in chess, for example, and in many games. In other words, make each element so that it has a problem in it itself, in the element, which needs to be solved by the person that you're trying to interpret. Another way to think of this, finally, is to think the chess piece is there. The chess piece is what it is, relatively speaking, more or less the same for every player that picks it up relative to the chess game. But the word isn't what it is, relatively. The word lures you into transforming it, because every use of it presents a fresh problem for you in how to connect it to your experience how to conceptualize it, how to say it, how to pronounce it, how to combine it in interesting combinations with other words to make phrases, and so on. Right. So that's not it quite for narrative. There's some more to be said about narrative, and we'll say it next time. And meanwhile, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye-bye.